Good evening. My name is Carl Brown, and I'm one of the ministers at North Highlands Baptist Church. And I'm so glad that you could join me tonight. Let me go on and say Happy New Year's. Tonight, if you're watching our premiere, is New Year's Eve. And I pray that 2021 is a great year for you and your family. And we can put 2020 to bed and say adieu and goodbye to all that made it such a challenge this last year. Now, I'm sure next year is going to be a challenge, but as you'll see even today, even through our hardest times, we are never alone, and we have great reason for hope, great reason for joy. So let me just say that this is our second to last backyard Bible study. We have been spending time since this pandemic started. Back in April is when we started going through this book. We had started this book in our discipleship classes in our church last January. And so it was a reading through the Old Testament in 1 year. It doesn't cover the entire Old Testament, but it takes you through most of the Old Testament in 1 year. And we have been covering that in these backyard Bible studies, following the reading pattern of the reading suggestions of this D-Life journal, Old Testament 1. Now, I don't know if that means they have an Old Testament 2 that goes through more of it. I don't know. But this is the book that we've been following, and there are only 2 more weeks in this book because we didn't start on January 1st. So this week is Daniel. We're going to be looking at the book of Daniel tonight. You can go in and turn your Bibles there. Next week, we'll be looking at one of the smaller books in the Old Testament, the book of Jonah. And that will be our last backyard Bible study. I hope you have enjoyed them. If you have enjoyed these studies, please make a comment either on Facebook or on YouTube, or feel free to share them. There's a playlist of all the Bible studies. I think when we're done, we'll have 43 Bible studies that we've done together in my backyard. And so if you want to share that, they will be there for the foreseeable future. All right, so hopefully you have found the book of Daniel, and you have a paper and pencil if you like to take notes, and you've separated yourself. You're ready for a good Bible study tonight. Let's get into the Word. Now, before we start with the book of Daniel, I want to talk about the man Daniel. Now, Daniel was a truly great man. I mean, we know through history that there are men who have changed the world, either through politics or through warfare and conquest, through invention. There are so many people who have changed the world that we've studied throughout time. But there are very few men who are known for their wisdom, for their administration, and for their advice and tact that they had. Daniel is one of those few men. Daniel is actually talked about in many different cultures and many different writings that they have. He is of royal blood. He's good looking. He had a keen mind. He was a prophet. He was a man of prayer. He was a phenomenal administrator. He was an advisor to many kings, at least 4, probably as many as 8. He had great integrity. He was faithful. He had faith in God's sovereignty. He had wisdom. He had understanding. He had knowledge. He had perseverance. He was humble. And he was known for all these things. But God put him on a very short list in Ezekiel when he listed the top 3 men in the Bible that were men of righteousness and intercessory prayer. And making a top 3 list of God for that kind of item is a great thing. And Daniel made that list. It was Noah, Job, and Daniel that God said, these guys are the greatest guys when it comes to intercessory prayer and righteousness. And Daniel was on the list. So Daniel is a truly, truly great man. And if you're named Daniel, or if you happen to have a son named Daniel, or friends named Daniel, you can tell them that they have been named after an incredible man of God. Now, just for a minute, let's talk about the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel was written by Daniel himself at the end of his life, or end of his ministry, near the end of his life. And he put in there several events that happened during the exile in the capital city, and showed God's sovereignty through it all. He also made it a book of prophecy that had been given to Daniel through visions. And now it is called the key to prophecy, because it covered future events immediately following Daniel all the way up until now, all the way until the time that Christ comes again. So it's full of very important prophecy, especially about our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, the Messiah. I'm not going to take you through the whole book of Daniel tonight, because that is way too much to grab and too big a chunk to fill. I know you're like, well, wait a minute. You did the whole book of Isaiah in one night. Well, no, not really. I did parts of it in one night. We're really going to cover tonight kind of the story of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel and their interactions tonight. So we're going to see the story, the transformation of King Nebuchadnezzar tonight. We're going to go over that. So we're going to cover the first four chapters of Daniel tonight. And then I'll just mention some highlights for the rest of the book that I hope that you take the time to read, because it is extremely interesting and full of really incredible stories. So let's start in Daniel 1, chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put them in the house of his God. Put the treasure in the house of his God. Now, before I go on, just a history lesson here. Jehoiakim is one of the children of Josiah. And Josiah was a great king and really followed the Lord. But after he died, they started swaying from that. Babylon was beginning to grow in power, and Egypt actually came up. The Pharaoh from Egypt came up to stop the growth of his power, and Josiah, instead of just sitting there and letting Egypt pass through their lands, Josiah decides to go out and attack the king of Egypt, and he was killed. And now Babylon continues to grow, and eventually it'll subdue Egypt as well. But before it got there, it took over Israel and Judah, what was left of Judah, and Jehoiakim was defeated, and now we have this exile that happens. Here we are. Verse 3, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men, without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He wanted the best of the best. Don't just bring me anybody. He says, no, I'm looking for the best of the best. He was a brand new king, King Nebuchadnezzar, and he wanted to surround himself with the very best people that he could from all the lands that he conquered. This was a very normal thing. When kings conquered a different land, they would take the very best of their nobility and make them servants in their court. It was kind of a status symbol. But before they could serve in the king's court, he wanted them trained. He wanted to give them ample opportunity. As you'll see, King Nebuchadnezzar was no dummy. He was a pretty smart man and pretty sharp in his own right. It says here that Ashpenaz, he was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them to a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. So here they're going to school. These best and brightest young men have been given a hardcore university scholarship. I mean, and it was a hardcore university. They had to learn the language. They had to learn all of their learning and all of their education that they could give them, and they were to be adept at all of it. And it's great. It had full scholarship. They got room and board, the best food that you could eat, the best place to stay. They got an internship. They got to serve in the king's palace. And they were guaranteed a job after 3 years serving the king. Or they somehow failed the king and didn't live up to the expectations, and then, so it's all or nothing for these guys. All or nothing for these exiles that are brought in. They have to learn under a very high stress situation. They have to be the best of the best, or they will be eliminated. Let's keep reading in verse 6. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. So now we have our cast: Daniel, or Belteshazzar, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I know you've heard those names. That's the names we use for them. But it's funny, we never use the name Belteshazzar for Daniel. Instead, we call him Daniel. It's probably because Daniel wrote the book. So now we come to Daniel's first problem, outside of being, taken far, far, far from his home and put in a foreign university in a foreign language and having to learn as quick as he can. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. So we have a real problem here. The problem is that they don't want to defile themselves with the king's food. Now, what does that mean? Well, the food was probably a very popular food that the Jews were not allowed to eat because of the rules in the Torah, was pork. And I don't, as a big bacon eater myself, and a lover of Boston butts and roast beef and barbecue, it's hard to believe, but they did not eat pork because God had told the Jews not to eat pork and several other kinds of meat. This was probably what they were being served. That, or maybe the meat was offered to other gods and dedicated to other gods before it was given to them. And who knows what else they were eating at the time. But my best guess is that they were putting in front of them a good bit of bacon and some pot roast, and he said, I can't have that. I can't have pork. And he didn't want to defile himself and defy God's law. Now, this is a really big problem for Daniel if he wants to stay faithful to his God. This is a real problem for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. If they want to stay faithful to their God, most people probably wouldn't be worried about that at all. Okay, our kingdom has been defeated. Our God has been defeated. He's forsaken us because now we're in exile. Here we are. He's punished us. Our kingdom is over. It's dead. There's no one left. We're in this new situation. You know what? It's time for a new God, new circumstances. I'm just going to make my way and go a new way. I think that's what most people would have done, but not Daniel. And so he saw this as a real problem. He didn't want to lose his favor with the Lord. He wanted to honor God. And the guy who was their attendant, the chief official, he also had a real problem. He had to obey the king. So Daniel shows his first step of wisdom here, and he gives a solution. Verse 11. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So the servant agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Very reasonable test. Now, what does this test do? Does this test show an aptitude by Daniel understanding nutrition and health and what's best for the human body? No, I don't think so. Not at all. They didn't have that kind of expertise and knowledge at that time, in my understanding. No, what I think this shows is a tremendous amount of faith in God. God says this is what we can eat. God says we shouldn't eat that. God knows what's best for us. So if we do what God says, it will be what's best for us, and there should be a noticeable difference. And he had faith that that was the case. He put his life on the line with his faith as a young teenager. Wow. In a foreign land. That's amazing. That's incredible. He was a great young man. So what happens? Well, God shows them favor. Let's look at verse 15. At the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding and all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered into the king's service. In a matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Man, there's a lot in that. Not only did they look better and healthier after 10 days, God blessed them in such a way that he gave them great knowledge and understanding and wisdom. And after he gave them those things, he gave them position. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. But they got the service of the king. They passed the test. The kings found that they were 10 times better than all, not just the recruits. They were 10 times better than all of his wise men that he already had. These 4 young men shone like stars when it came to their wisdom and understanding. That's something only God can do. And that brings us to our first lesson tonight. I want you to understand this. God is the giver of knowledge. God is the giver of understanding and wisdom. And God is the one who gives us our position in life. And so thank God for what wisdom and understanding you have. Thank God for the wisdom and understanding and knowledge that he gives our teachers, the people who teach us. And thank him for that, because none of it is on their own. All wisdom and knowledge and understanding is given from God. It is a gift. And so is the position that we're put in. And we are to use it to honor God. And that's exactly what Daniel did. He was chosen. They were chosen among the best of the land of Judah. And because they were chosen and given this opportunity, Daniel used that opportunity to honor God. He was not going to defile himself before God. And so here's the second point. If you honor God, he will honor you. That's a promise. Honor God, and he will honor you. Chapter 2 wasn't in your reading, but I think it's just really important for the story of King Nebuchadnezzar. So the first thing he sees is that, Nebuchadnezzar sees, is that God has given, that there is something special. Let's put it that way. There is something special about these 4 young men. There's something really special about them. Why are they different than all the others? So King Nebuchadnezzar is already curious, and we're going to see what happens next. In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and then interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There is not a man on earth who can do what the king asked. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult." Like I said, Nebuchadnezzar was no dummy. And what this tells me, if I read this, not only did he have a really bad dream, but he had decided in his mind before he had all of his wise men come. Now remember, Daniel and his guys, they're in the university, okay? So they're in the university for 3 years. So they're just there. This is in the second year of that. They haven't even been in the university for a full year. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he's like, "Guys, I am tired of being manipulated by you. You're always doing things and trying to get things to work out and where you can be happy in your own schemes and you love your positions of power. So you tell me that you're psychics." They didn't use the word psychics, magicians and enchanters and whatever. So for all this time, they've been telling the king that they can divine things, and a lot of psychics use these tricks now. You'll come in and they'll gather information from looking at you and everything, and they're able to trick you into believing that they know a lot more about you than they know. And they'll use all kinds of tricks to glean out of you, whether you've had tragedy in your life or different things, and then they'll give you a hopeful looking future and manipulate you into believing that they have great mysterious knowledge. Well, that's their trade. That's what they've been doing. And Nebuchadnezzar, no dummy, is tired of it. King Neb says, "No, you tell me the dream. Then I'll know that you really can read minds. Then I know that you really do have some kind of divine, mysterious power. You tell me the dream. You've talked all the time about how wise and knowledgeable you are, and how you have influence over the gods. Well, then you should be able to tell me the dream. You tell me the dream and then interpret it, and then I can trust your interpretation because you have some kind of source, some kind of divine source that you would know it." And the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers, enchanters, all of them knew that they'd been called on the carpet, and that it was over for them, because there's no trick that they could do to learn the king's dream. No way they could guess it, that the light was shining on their dark arts, and they were realizing that it was just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. So they come to the king and they're like, "That's too hard. Nobody can do that. I don't know why you're asking that. Nobody can do that. That's too hard. No man on earth can do it." So they all agree that no man on earth can do that. Look at the second part of verse 11. I love this, how God sets things up. It says, "No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men." Verse 12. "This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death." So that's it. He said there was just one outcome for you if you couldn't do it. He meant it. So now all the wise men in whatever category they fall into, all the wise men were going to be put to death. Well, who does that include? That includes the University of Wise Men. And so the University of Wise Men is about to be cleaned out. He's going to kill them all and start over. Even the guys who just got there. Look at this. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and the men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He's good. He's really good. He asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh order? Daniel doesn't disagree with the order. He doesn't try to defy the order. He's just, why? Why did he give such a harsh order? Because they didn't know. They were at the university. They weren't part of the big meetings. Then Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Daniel's given another problem. It's a real problem. It's life and death. Once again, this is a life and death problem. God's given him position. Daniel has the faith that God didn't bring him to Babylon and put him in this position just to be slaughtered, just to be killed within the first year that he's in the University of Wise Men. So Daniel takes a bold step and asks to approach the king. He approaches the king and he asks the king for more time. Now, this is not one of his normal wise men. This is just a kid in the university. And so, the king, I guess he saw favor with Daniel and he gave him a little bit of time. Not much time, but he gave him a little bit of time to get this figured out. Now, Daniel uses wisdom and tact, but what's his solution to the problem? I love this. Look in verse 17. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Daniel's answer to the problem was prayer. And not just prayer himself, but asking for other men of faith to pray with him. He asked other people of faith, join me on this prayer. Have you ever come across a problem that didn't seem like it had a solution? Daniel was just as puzzled by this as anyone else. He didn't know the dream. He couldn't divinely guess what the dream was and then interpret it. He was just as in the dark as any of the other guys. But his answer to that was not to just panic and run or to, try to manipulate the king. No. His answer to a real problem with no foreseeable solution was prayer. And not just prayer, asking for prayer from others. Let's all pray about this together. Pray with me. Let's all ask God to show us mercy and give us a solution to this problem. Without even knowing anything else, that's a good lesson for us. When you're come across a situation like this, don't panic. Don't panic. Come to it with wisdom and with tact. And more than that, come with prayer and faith that God has a purpose for you and an answer to your prayer. Daniel and his friends had tremendous faith in God, that they were there for a reason, that God had a purpose for their position, and so they prayed to the Lord for mercy to give them an answer to this mystery. Let's see what happens. Verse 19. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised God of heaven. So God gave him an answer. God gave him an answer that night in a dream, in a vision. He answered his prayer and showed him the same dream. And what did Daniel do in response to that? Oh, great king, I am so wise. Oh, great king, I have figured it out. Oh, great king, no one is as smart as I am or as what. No, Daniel praised God because he knew that God was the one who had given him wisdom and understanding. And we have a beautiful prayer here for a few verses 20 through 23 of Daniel thanking God and thinking of thanking God and praising God for his wisdom, his understanding, and recognition that he is the giver of knowledge and wisdom. Look at the last verse of it. Verse 23, I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Let's step back to our last lesson for a second. So when you have a problem that doesn't seem that it has a solution, and you take that problem to the Lord in prayer, and the Lord answers your prayer, make sure that you take time out, just a quick time out before I do anything else, before I act on this revelation. Thank you, God. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for answering. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord when you are given an answer to your prayers. All right, let's look at verse 24. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. I love how Arioch took credit for that. Verse 26, then the king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, no. No wise man, enchanter, magician, diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. What does Daniel do? Daniel doesn't take the credit at all. He says, no, I can't do it. Matter of fact, none of these guys can do it. Just like they said, just like all of them said, no one can do it except a God. Only a God can do that, and God does not dwell among men. He is reinforcing what the magicians had said. And then he doubles down on it. He says, no one can do that, but there is a God in heaven who reveals these things. And he has revealed to you, great Nebuchadnezzar, things that are to come. And here is your dream. This is beginning to clue King Nebuchadnezzar in that there is something different about Daniel and something different about these other three guys. That why they stand out, why they stand apart. Here they are still in the University of Wise Men, and King Neb is seeing that they are tapped into a God of heaven, the great God of heaven. And so then Daniel goes and he actually tells the king his dream. He tells him that in his dream he saw a large statue, and that the statue had different parts, a head of gold, shoulders of silver, and then bronze, and clay mixed with steel and iron. Then he talks of this great rock that's going to hit the statue and shatter all of it. All of it, the gold, the bronze, the iron, the silver, the clay, all the bits together, is going to destroy all of it. And then that rock is going to grow up to the size of a mountain that's going to cover the entire earth. So that's the dream. And then Daniel interprets the dream for him. And it's an amazing dream, and it's something we can really learn from. So the dream is talking about 5 different kingdoms. It's talking about, he says that the head of gold is you, Nebuchadnezzar, and your fantastic kingdom that you've built here, the kingdom of the Babylonians. He says, but after you, After the Babylonian kingdom will come another kingdom, and that's silver. And that probably made Nebuchadnezzar feel good because silver's not as great as gold. So the silver kingdom is not going to be as good as his kingdom. So after he's going to come the silver, and then after the silver comes, the bronze, and then the iron. And the kingdoms that it's talking about is the kingdom of Babylon, then the Persian kingdom that takes over all that same land, and then the Grecian kingdom that comes in and conquers all of it with Alexander the Great. And then after Alexander the Great comes in, the Roman kingdom comes in the Iron Age and destroys or takes over all the land that the Greeks had and even more, and becomes the greatest kingdom on earth for a period of time. And then it talks about in that dream, he says that there will be a rock that comes during the Roman kingdom. During the Roman kingdom, there will become a rock that will come and it will destroy all the other kingdoms. And that rock will become a mountain and will establish a kingdom that will last for eternity and will never end. There will not be a kingdom after it. What is he talking about? He's talking about during the time of the Roman kingdom, the Messiah will come. The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Son of God will come and will establish his kingdom, which will have no end. This is a direct prophecy about the rock, the King of Kings, Jesus, the rock, the Messiah, the Christ, who is coming and will establish a forever kingdom that will never end. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. Jesus is that rock. So how does Nebuchadnezzar respond? How does King Neb respond to this prophecy that is given to him in a dream, and God has interpreted through Daniel? Look in verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. He went prostrate before Daniel. He got on his face, not on his knees. He got on his face before Daniel and honored him. It says here in verse 47, Then the king said to Daniel, Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords and a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. Daniel becomes administrator over the entire capital, and he puts his friends, he remembers his friends and puts them over provinces in Babylon and puts them on his staff. And God raises him to a very high position, the highest position in the land next to the king. And he's in the king's court all the time. So now there's someone who believes in God, who follows God, and has not defiled himself in the king's royal court, who the king listens to. That's a God thing. That's turning something from exile into promotion. and only God could have done what he did. Matter of fact, they never finished the University of Wise Men. This happened in the first year they're in the University of Wise Men. So they far exceeded expectations and were raised to the highest positions before they even finished school. How about that? And became in charge of all the wise men. Which, by the way, speaks to our lesson last week about how Daniel taught these wise men, I believe, the Torah and the wisdom of God. And that's how they knew to be looking and when to look for the Star of Bethlehem. All right, that was last week. Go look that up. And now that you see he's been put in the royal court. And he stays there in that royal court for decades. That brings us to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is the story of the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And there's one person who's not mentioned in all of chapter 3, and that's Daniel. In the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going to the fiery furnace, Daniel's not mentioned. Yet we know Daniel's around. We know Daniel is in the royal court. We know that Daniel is their boss. We know that he has not left. He is there. So why is this story not about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? I have a theory about this. Now this is Carl. This is me. This is my theory. And I haven't heard anyone else say this, so I'm sure there are wiser, smarter people than me out there who probably have a better theory. But here's what I think. I think that chapter 3 is a direct response to chapter 2. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar is just coming into his full power, and now Daniel has just told him that he is the head of this great statue that he saw in this vision, and he's the head of gold, that he's going to have this great kingdom and that it's going to have great power. Well, that kind of goes to Nebuchadnezzar's head. And I think Nebuchadnezzar really liked having Daniel, who had a tap into the God of heaven. Daniel was the source, the answer to the king's dreams and visions. Daniel tapped into the God of heaven for that. Now, Nebuchadnezzar did not want to mess up that informant from the God of heaven. So he was not going to ask Daniel to defile himself or worship a different God, because he didn't want to offend the God of heaven, who, through Daniel, was giving him great wisdom. So I think Daniel was exempted for the rest of his time with Nebuchadnezzar from any of these other things with other gods, because Nebuchadnezzar wanted to keep in good with Daniel, who kept in good with the God of heaven. Does that make sense? That's my theory. So I think Daniel was exempt in this next chapter. And again, I think this next chapter is a direct response to chapter 2. Let me explain. I'm not going to read it. You're very familiar with this story. King Nebuchadnezzar makes a statue 90 feet tall, and he has his musicians write a nice little jingle that every time that this jingle is played by anybody on any instrument, that everybody's supposed to face that. Everybody is supposed to face that great statue and kneel down and worship that statue of Nebuchadnezzar, treating him as a god king. And again, I think Daniel was exempt because of chapter 2. Well, who wasn't exempt? Everybody else. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not exempt in the circumstances. Now, and everybody already knew about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Everybody from the Wise University knew about it, and all the other men knew about it because of Daniel, because they were placed over all these other guys. And so they already had this jealousy thing going on, and so they were keeping their eye on them. So why do I think that this statue is a response to the dream that he had and that Daniel interpreted? Because in his dream, it was a large statue with a head of gold, and he was the head of the statue. In chapter 3, he makes a large statue, probably as large as this other one looked to him, 90 feet tall. That is enormous. 90 feet is huge. Look at the tallest pole that you see out there, telephone pole, and double it. That's 90 feet. It's a really tall statue. And it's made of gold, just like his dream. And then he has everybody bow down and worship it, because he believes he's some kind of God king. He wants to be some kind of God king. So that's the connection. If you want to see a really good, an excellent interpretation of this story, if you have not ever watched VeggieTales, that's right, I said VeggieTales, a Christian cartoon called VeggieTales. If you've not ever seen their little movie called Rack, Shack, and Benny, It's fantastic, and it's very biblically accurate. So go watch it. It's one of my absolute favorite Veggie Tales of all time. One of my favorite cartoons of all time, animations, is Rack, Shack, and Benny by Veggie Tales. It tells this whole story. All right, so what happens? Well, you know what happens. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refuse to bow down before the statue when the jingle plays, and they won't do it. They will not do it. And all the other wise men and all the people from the University of Wise Men realize that they won't, and they point it out. Why? Because they're jealous. And so they point it out, and so they go to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is furious. He says, why won't you? I've given you these great positions. I've risen you up above everybody else, and now you're going to insult me by not doing this? And their response is so good. And Nebuchadnezzar, knows that these guys are shining stars when it comes to his wise men, so he actually gives them a second chance. He gives them a second chance. He says, all right, listen, maybe you didn't hear it right, but you're required to do this. We're going to play the music, and if you just bow down now, very good. But if you don't, that's it. You're going to go to the fiery furnace. Life and death problem. How do Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego respond? This is obviously out of Daniel's hands. There's nothing he can do. It's between Nebuchadnezzar and them directly. They respond with faith. They respond strong with faith and resolve that they're going to be faithful to their God. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. What? If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Could you say anything else more to insult King Nebuchadnezzar or to make him angry? I don't think so. Could you have said anything else that showed more faith and more resolve and faithfulness in your God and loyalty to your God than what they said? I don't think so. I mean, that is absolutely phenomenal. You know what? Nebuchadnezzar, you want to know who can save us? Our God can save us. We don't even have to defend ourselves. God will defend us. And he can certainly save us from your hand, even though you're this great emperor. But if he chooses not to save us, we're good with that. We are still not going to worship your gods, and we're still not going to worship that image when you play your little jingle. Wow. Well, Nebuchadnezzar blew his top, so to speak. He had them make the furnace 7 times hotter than it normally is, and he threw them into the furnace, and he had the strongest men in his kingdom throw them in, and the strongest warriors in his kingdom died because of the heat blast that hit them when they opened the furnace door. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fully dressed in their turbans and all, walked right into the furnace. And then the king, being able to see into the furnace, says, hey, didn't we throw 3 guys in there? Why do I see 4 guys walking around? And the 4th guy looks like the Son of God. Here we have possibly another Christophany. Jesus appearing in the Old Testament. And this time, he is in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's in there with them, and they're walking around talking. I wonder about that conversation. Boy, how y'all doing today? I don't know. It's a little hot. I don't know what they talked about, but here they are, and here he is in there with them. Now, if it wasn't a Christophany, it was very much an angel of the Lord that was there, because he was shining, he was bright, he was like the sons of God. So either an angel or Jesus himself, the angel of the Lord, showed up in the furnace with them in answer to their faith and their loyalty to the Most High God. You honor God, He will honor you. So then Nebuchadnezzar yells in there, "Hey guys, come on out, come on out, come on out of there. I've cooled off. Y'all come on out." And when they come out, everybody there notices that not a single thing is burned up. All these mighty men have died, just throwing them in the furnace, but not a hair of their head has been singed, and their turbans are fine, their clothes are fine, their sandals are fine. They all look fine, cool as a cucumber, so to speak. And so they come out, and what does the king say in response to this great miracle that God has shown to save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Look in verse 29. This is Nebuchadnezzar speaking. "Therefore, I decree that any people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are to be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Once again, they are faithful to God. God honors them and raises them up to a higher position. And the king himself recognizes the God of heaven for the second time. The first time, he recognized that this God of heaven had all knowledge. The second time, he noticed that this God of heaven has all power. And then he makes this decree that no one is allowed to blaspheme against the God of heaven, and anybody who wants to is allowed to worship them. So why did God do this? Why did God do this with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Why did he do this with Daniel? Why did they have these life and death problem situations at the very beginning of the exile, very near the beginning of the exile, and at the very beginning of the person who put them in exile, King Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor, king of the whole region, the king of kings of that area? Why did he have these encounters with Almighty God? Now, Israel was being punished. They were in exile as punishment for their adultery against God, of their following other gods, and not following the Lord God. And so they were to be punished for 70 years. They were to be in exile. Well, when that happens, that's an entire generation. When an entire generation of people are born, live their full life, and die, separated from the religion, separated from the beliefs, and spread out throughout the whole world, not a part of their family or their clan or their tribe, then usually that's the death of it. That's the end of it. You don't come back from that. Israel doesn't come back from that. No tribe comes back from that. There are no longer any one of that tribe or that belief system. They've incorporated the belief system and have become part of wherever they are, wherever they live. But what God did was at the very beginning of the exile, he puts Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in there and puts them in position to have these conflicts with the king, to where the king recognizes first that there is a God in heaven that has all knowledge. And he sets someone up in his royal court to advise him. And the second thing he realizes is that this same God that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worship as well has all power. And now everybody is allowed to worship him, and no one is allowed to blaspheme against him. So the children of Israel, who are spread out all over the known civilization, are now allowed to, instead of worshiping the gods of the households they're servants in or slaves in, they're allowed to worship their own God, the Lord God, and no one's allowed to say anything against them. So in their bondage, in their slavery, God gave them freedom of religion, freedom to worship their God, and to keep his commands. God orchestrated all that so that when the people of Israel could come home at the end of the 70 years, they could continue to pass down their beliefs, pass down knowledge and histories of their God to their children. That is so important. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel had to go through all this testing for that to happen. God is glorified. God is honored. God's people were free to worship him. And King Nebuchadnezzar has had these two incredible encounters. And that brings us to chapter 4. Chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar, listen to this. To the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous, and I had a dream that made me afraid. Before I get to his dream, I just want you to catch the difference of this chapter. Daniel has included in here a letter that was written, a proclamation that was written for all people by King Nebuchadnezzar. He probably had Daniel write it down for him, but he makes it sure it's in his own tongue. I, Nebuchadnezzar, he says it more than once. I, Nebuchadnezzar, am writing this. I, Nebuchadnezzar, am the one telling this story. This is my story about the Most High God and how awesome he is. That should get your attention right away. He didn't believe in the Most High God. He named Daniel Belteshazzar after his own God, and he called it his own God, and he worshiped him. Well, something's changed in Nebuchadnezzar. What possibly could have caused this change that he would be giving accolades and worship to the Most High God? Let's find out. Such an interesting story. He has another dream. Verse 7. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Verse 8. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. Why is it finally that it goes to Daniel? I think it's this reason. I think it's just because Daniel's busy. He's put Daniel in charge of all of Babylon. He's over all the wise men. So he probably has these group of people who come to him, and he asks all of them first. It may have been curiosity. He may have wanted to see what they would say in response, and then what Daniel would say in response. But regardless, he asked all of them, and none of them could interpret his dream, and he even gave them the dream this time. And so finally, I love how he said finally. So maybe Daniel was on a trip. Maybe he was away. It seems like he's grateful that Daniel finally came into the king's presence, though. Finally, Daniel's here. I'll get some answers. Finally, Daniel came, and he asked him to interpret the dream. Listen to what he says in verse 18. This is the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had. Now, Belteshazzar, Daniel, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Again, he recognizes that connection that Daniel has to something greater than Daniel. So he told Daniel the dream, and then Daniel's response is this. Look in verse 19. Then Daniel was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Daniel, I think, understood the dream right away, because it said that he was terrified and he was trying to figure out how this could come true, and how on earth am I going to tell the king this, because it's bad. It's really bad. It's not good news. Matter of fact, that's what he says. Belteshazzar answered, Daniel answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. He says, it's really bad, king. King's like, well, don't worry, Daniel. Even if it's bad, just tell me the news. King Neb, he was no wimp. He can handle it. Daniel interprets the dream for him, and it is bad. It's a decree from God that Nebuchadnezzar needed to learn humility. that Nebuchadnezzar was getting too big for his britches, and he was thinking that Nebuchadnezzar was great instead of God was great. And so God had already given him these two great opportunities to turn to him with what happened with his first dream and what happened with the fiery furnace. And now he's ruled all these years and he has not turned to him. Now God's like, well, you're getting too big for your britches. I'm going to remind you who's really in control. And God's decree is that for there would be a period of time that the king would go insane and that he would be out in the wild and that he would run around with wild animals and that he would eat grass, he would sleep outside, and his hair would have like feathers, be all decorated, have feathers in it. His nails would be like claws, and that for 7 time periods he would be in this state. Scholars believe the 7 times are seasons, and so we're talking like almost 2 years that he was going to be in this state. And then when he finally honored God and humbled himself, that his sanity would be returned and his kingdom would be returned. That's pretty bad news. So that was his decree. So in verse 27, we have Daniel's response to this decree by God that he just interpreted for the king. He says, "Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." So what does the king do? Now this is Nebuchadnezzar telling the story. What does Nebuchadnezzar, what's King Neb do with this advice? Nothing. He does nothing. So what happens? Verse 29. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, a year later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. He said, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence for my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" He set into bragging, as men will do. Look at verse 31. The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from the people." And he's going to have all these things happen to him. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people and ate grass like cattle, his body drenched with the dew of the heaven, until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle, and his nail and like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, I think this is the most important verse we read today. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Wow. Wow. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, exalt God. Before it was, okay, Daniel's God, everybody's going to respect Daniel's God because he knows all things. All right? Everybody's going to respect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God because he has all power. And he's also Daniel's God, and he knows all things. So they're free to worship that God. Now it's I, Nebuchadnezzar, glorify and exalt the Most High God. I see that he has dominion over all things. So he realized that this God of the Israelites, this God of Judah, had all knowledge and all power. But that wasn't enough for Nebuchadnezzar to worship him. Why? Because he is rich, because he is powerful, probably. Because he's the greatest king of that time? Yes, absolutely. He was full of pride. So God showed him beyond that, he is sovereign. He is sovereign over all people, all kings, all nations, all earth, all things, that he is the sovereign God. And I think this is a conversion experience for Nebuchadnezzar. That's what I think. I hope it is. I'd love to have a conversation with him when I get to heaven. But we don't hear any more about Nebuchadnezzar after this. It says that he was restored to his honor and he got his kingdom back, and it was greater than it ever was before. So it sounds like God honored him some more, and so it sounds like he honored God some more. And so in my mind, I think this was probably a conversion experience for Nebuchadnezzar. And it certainly benefited all the people of Israel who had been exiled all over. Wow. That's the story of King Neb. If you had not known all that story, it is good to know. I tell you what, there are some things we should really glean from that. God is always working. Even when you are in your darkest night, even when you think that you are exiled, that you are alone, that you've been forsaken, that there's no help, God is always working for you. God is always thinking about you. God is always present. And he has all sovereignty and power for you in your situation. God's always there. He is great. He is worthy of your faithfulness. He is faithful to you when you're not faithful to him, as we've learned time and time again. And get this, God will make a way. God was making a way for the Israelites and the Judeans, all of them, all the Jews. He is making a way for them to be able to worship him and follow his decrees, even though they lived in a foreign land under foreign kings. That's a great, mighty God. How wonderful. How wonderful. Man, this is a really good book. Book of Daniel. I love the book of Daniel. There are many great things in there. The next chapter, he starts serving other kings. And, he ends up having to deal with Belshazzar and the writing on the wall. That's where we get the phrase, the writing on the wall. We have the Daniel in the lion's den when he's under King Darius. And then his son, Cyrus the Great, ended the exile. And that's probably when Daniel's ministry ended. But then he had a prophecy that has all these future events. That's all in Daniel. And he had this incredible prayer that you can read in Daniel for the people of Israel, that God would bless them and that he would end their exile and that they would follow God and that he would forgive them. An incredible prayer, intercessory prayer by Daniel. And then we have a response to that by God that's delivered by the archangel Michael. This is where we finally see and hear about the archangel Michael, and he has this conversation with Daniel. It's a fantastic reading. You should read the whole book. But tonight I wanted you to just know about King Neb, King Nebuchadnezzar, and God's transformation of him and what he did for him and how that blessed all of the Jews of Israel, even in exile. Honor God, and he will honor you. He did Daniel, he did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he did King Neb as well. I hope you enjoyed that study. Oh, it's a good one, isn't it? It's a great book. I know it's probably going to be one of the longer ones. There's just so much in there. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next week when we'll go over the book of Jonah. I'm sure it's very familiar to you. And it will be our last study together for our backyard Bible studies. So I hope to see you then. Good night.